Thanks for coming out, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Tom Lanning. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors and supports lectures, conferences, other special programming that explore basic questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. You can learn more and watch our past lectures at holycross.edu/McFarland Center, and eventually this one. Your friends who didn't come, you can tell them what they missed. Today we have a chance to think together about really important ethical issues surrounding affirmative action. Affirmative action is a social policy nested in a set of larger issues, ones that our speaker will help us to examine today. Behind it are questions of how we come to terms with centuries of brutal, deliberate oppression, about enduring legacies from that oppression that reverberate across generations, about ways that the oppression itself is not solely an artifact of history, but in many times and places endures. And it's about what sort of reparation we owe in return, to whom and how. Is affirmative action the best way to achieve it? How has it worked as a social policy? How do we evaluate that? I'd argue that affirmative action is an essential tool, that it's a moral obligation, even if it's not enough on its own. Even people like me who believe in that have to face up to the fact, though, that the number of black students and students of color in elite universities, Latinos at least, has barely budged in the last 50 years. A Harvard suit, among others, claims, we're told, maybe disingenuously, and perhaps honestly from some other people's perspectives, that our attempts to right legacies of slavery and the like are carried out at the cost of discrimination to others, notably Asian Americans. At Holy Cross, as many of you know, we've been grasping, and not fully successfully so, to come to grips with the fact that Holy Cross owes an element of its foundation and its 19th century survival after the fire in Fenwick to the sale of enslaved people. But even at an institution whose mission statement insists that we have a special obligation to the world's poor and powerless, we have only begun to grapple with what that obliges us to do in our own community. Whatever the national conversation, we have a lot to deal with in our own house. To help us explore a range of issues centering on affirmative action, but also more broadly on persistent inequality, I'm pleased to welcome an economist who's well known for critiques of social policy and racial inequality. Glenn Loury is Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at Brown University. He taught previously at Boston University, Harvard, Northwestern, and the University of Michigan. And as an academic economist, Professor Loury has published mainly in the areas of applied microeconomic theory, game theory, industrial organization, natural resource economics, and economics of race and inequality. As a social critic and public intellectual, he's published over 200 essays and reviews in journals of public affairs in the US and abroad. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a contributing editor to the Boston Review, and he was for many years a contributing editor at the New Republic. His books include One by One, From the Inside Out, Essays and Reviews on Race and Responsibility in America, which won the American Book Award and the Christianity Today Book Award in 1995. The Anatomy of Racial Inequality, Ethnicity, Social Mobility, and Public Policy, comparing the US and the UK, and Race, Incarceration, and American Values. He hosts The Glenn Show, split-screen dialogues on economic, political, and social issues at bloggingheads.tv. Please join me in welcoming Glenn Loury.
Thanks very much, Professor Landy. Good to be here at the College of the Holy Cross. That's my first experience with your institution, and I'm honored to be asked to speak about this issue. Now, I have a little bit of a logistic issue here. I have to figure out how to know what I'm showing you without being able to see it in front of me, so I'll be turning occasionally and looking over, but please don't think I'm being rude when I do that. Let me not mince words. We've got a problem here in the United States in the year 2019 in terms of persisting racial inequality. It is without a doubt, in part, a legacy of our ignoble past. I'm talking about the institution of chattel slavery, and I'm talking about a century of unfreedom and unequal citizenship for African Americans after the emancipation. Something should be done about it. There is a moral imperative that we as a society, we Americans, address ourselves in a concerted way to redressing the consequences of that past. I don't think affirmative action is the answer to that question. I don't think it's the remedy for that problem. I think it's a distraction from what needs to be done to deal with that problem. That doesn't mean it should never be practiced. That doesn't mean it's morally wrong. Those are separate questions. That doesn't mean there don't exist problems for which affirmative action is a suitable policy solution or remedy. There do. They do. There do exist such problems. Obtaining an adequate representation of diverse ethnic groups at elite institutions of higher education is one of the goals that is abetted by the use of affirmative action. But even that is not coming without a cost. So I want to do a couple of things here. I first want to try to defend what I just got through saying about the fact that we have a problem. We have a problem. Racial inequality is deep and abiding. Here in the 21st century, it doesn't show any sign of going away. We are lesser of a nation for that. We can do better than that. Okay? I do not want to be misunderstood. I will be saying things critical about affirmative action. That doesn't mean that I'm unaware of or unsympathetic to the fact that this problem persists, or that I'm willing to let people off the hook of their moral responsibilities in the face of it. But I'm also a hard-headed pragmatist. We are in the year 2019. We're a half century past the advent of affirmative action. We need to take stock. We need to be serious about assessing the consequences of what we do. And when I venture down that road, I have my doubts. Again, let me not mince words. The goal should be racial equality. The long-term goal of what we do in the aftermath of our ignoble history should be creating a circumstance of equal dignity, respect, standing, and status across the racial group lines. We are a long way from doing that. Institutionalizing the practice of assessing African Americans for selection into elite and competitive arenas, institutionalizing the practice of assessing African Americans who are competing with others for access to selective and elite arenas. Making that a permanent way of doing business is inconsistent with the goal of racial equality. It invites us to become liars. It invites us to pretend that things that are true are not true. It invites us to look the other way. It's patronizing. It's undignified. Let me say that again. Knowing that I'm being judged by standards that are different and less rigorous in virtue of the fact that my ancestors suffered some indignity is undignified. It's patronizing. It's not equality. It's the opposite of equality. I know why people do it. Because it's the easiest path. It's the path of least resistance. If I were an administrator of a selective institution that looked at the data and saw that blacks were 2% or 3% or 4% of my student body living in the world that we live in today, I'd want to do something about that. And if I found that admitting African American students at the 70th percentile of the distribution of performance when the typical students admitted to my venue are at the 90th percentile, if I found that doing that eased my public relations problem, I would seize upon that path of least resistance to get past that problem. The question, however, is whether or not 1 million people like me, 100,000 people like me in that same situation, doing that thing in an ongoing way as an institutionalized practice, placing that behavior beyond criticism, is consistent with equality, and I assert to you that it is not. Again, I want to be direct. I don't want to mince words, and I don't want to waste our time. if we don't address ourselves to the developmental disparities that are manifest when we look at the test scores and we see the blacks not scoring high, if we don't effectively change the dynamics of human development that are the root and at the basis of the reality of African American underrepresentation in elite and selective venues, we will never solve the inequality problem. We're only fooling ourselves if we think that head counts are a substitute for performance. They are not. Everybody knows that they are not. Everybody knows that if you're only admitting, 1 in 10 applicants to a venue of higher education, everybody knows that that kind of competition is going to result in differences in the performance of people. You can't paper over the racial dimension of those differences by simply adopting a policy. You must, if you really want equality, be engaged in activities that remedy the foundational circumstances that are reflected in the underrepresentation of African Americans at the Bronx High School of Science or Brooklyn Tech or whatever it might be, at Harvard or Yale or Cornell or the College of the Holy Cross or whatever it might be. That's the position that I want to defend. Okay, so that no one goes to sleep during my talk, I want to reiterate, I'm for racial equality, not for patronization. Don't patronize my people. Don't inflict on us the consequences of a soft bigotry of low expectations. Don't presume that we're not capable of objectively expressing excellence in the same way as any other people are expressing excellence. Don't judge us by a different standard. Don't lower the bar. Why are you lowering the bar? What's going on there? Is that about guilt or pity? Tell me a pathway to equality that is rooted in either one of those things. You're not going to find it. Is it about guilt? Oh my, how we've treated the blacks. Or is it about pity? We know they're not quite up to it, but that's okay. We'll look the other way. Okay, so that's my message. I said that I wanted to say something about inequality. Goodness, what did I do? Okay. We've got a problem, okay? I've got slides here. I can't give a talk like this looking up at this thing, so I'm going to have to ask you to bear with me a bit. Am I still okay on the AV side? Okay. We got a problem. Here's my challenging thesis sound at the bottom of this slide. There are two narratives, a biased narrative and a development narrative. The biased narrative says, even in the year 2019, white supremacy and institutional racism keeps black people from being able to get access to venues that are elite and selective. It's discrimination, it's racism, it's another form of racism for which the remedy would be affirmative action. I reject that narrative in the year 2019. Of course, it was a correct narrative in the year 1969, but we're a half century on from that. Really, does anybody believe that I teach at Brown University? Brown University is a racist institution? Does anybody really believe that? A lot of people say it. That it is hostile to diversity and inclusion. That affirmative action policies are the proof that Brown University is on the right side of history? Does anybody believe that the biased narrative accounts for the relatively low number of African Americans who are able to gain admission to Harvard University the way the Asian American students are doing by performing in an outstanding way at some of the most difficult intellectual tasks that humans are asked to perform? That's what elite higher education is. It's mastery over difficult intellectual work. It's doing something that, by definition, not everybody does equally well. That's what it is. Is the underrepresentation of African Americans in those venues, such as it is at Caltech and MIT and so forth, a consequence of racial bias? Who believes that? I don't think any serious person believes it. It is a consequence of underdevelopment. Now, has the underdevelopment got a genealogy rooted in bias? We could parse that, sure. Am I not aware of the fact that historically African Americans were not afforded equal opportunity in the housing market, that they were not given a fair chance to accumulate their wealth, that they did not inherit from their ancestors what they might have inherited and to which they were due because their ancestors were enslaved and not compensated properly for their labor and didn't get 40 acres and a mule after the emancipation? Sure. Do I not think that some of the social and cultural problems that might impair the development of African American intellectual performance have their root in a history, an ignoble history of racism and slavery? Yes, I'm aware of that. I'm aware of that. But do I think that the problem of inequality for African Americans in the year 2019 is mainly an expression of a racist society? No, I don't believe that. And I don't think the data support that claim. Two narratives, bias and development. We get to choose two narratives. The white man has done us wrong, or we need to enhance our capacities to perform. Two narratives. Institutionalized racism, or a continuing failure of African Americans and others, of course, to realize our full human potential in this society. What would be the remedies for that? Do you think that jiggering the test score standards for selecting people to get into elite institutions is a remedy for that? I don't. That's the problem. Affirmative action is not the remedy. Now, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that the right wing of the US Supreme Court, which includes a distinguished alumnus of this institution, are standing on solid ground when they declare that the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution forbids a public institution from using race as a factor in selecting students to admit to its student body. I'm not saying that. I don't believe that. I believe that's a distortion of the 14th, a perverse distortion, you could even say. On the one hand, the 14th Amendment is meant to ensure the equal citizenship of African Americans, only imperfectly achieved. On the other hand, you're going to take that same provision of the US Constitution and use it to bar public actors from undertaking policies explicitly intended to remedy the consequences of that violation of the principles of equal protection? No, I don't buy that. So I'm not saying that. Here's what else I'm not saying. Because affirmative action uses race, and because blacks are benefited and whites are not benefited, it's a racist policy. You did not hear me say that. I didn't say that. I don't believe it. I did say that it's a patronizing policy, and I do believe that. And we can have an argument about that. But since this is a center on ethics, I want to be clear about exactly what ethical position I'm taking. And it's not a stick-figured, colorblind, let's get beyond race, race doesn't matter anymore. Read my books, you'll see that I don't think that. I've never thought that. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that as between the two narratives to guide how it is that we Americans go forward here into the middle of the 21st century, dealing with the legacy of our ignoble past, as between those two narratives, white supremacy done me wrong, structural racism keeps blacks from getting above 600 on the SAT math. As between that narrative on the one hand, and the other, the development narrative, the one that I favor, the one that says, my God, how much human potential is not being realized. What are we going to do about that? I prefer the development narrative. Here's why. These are data just illustrating how deep is the chasm separating the status and economic and social terms of African Americans from the rest of the society. It's a very, very real problem to which affirmative action is not the answer. And so I'll just go through this quickly. These are household incomes at the median in 2014, broken down by racial group. You see where the blacks are, you see where the whites and the Asians are. These are somebody's efforts to estimate wealth holdings, again, at the population median. Why you would use the ratio of medians of two distributions as a statistic of the inequality between them escapes me, except for the fact that you get a large number when your sample has many zeros in it. Y'all follow that? Y'all do the statistics in the Ethics Center? Most people don't have very much wealth. A lot of people have negative wealth. The median is the 50th percentile. If I'm dealing with a population with a lot of poor people in it, there's a good chance that the 50th percentile is going to have a very low wealth number. If I take the ratio of the white population to the black population at the median, and I get a number of 13, that's a meaningless statistic in my mind for the reasons that I've tried to explain. But you can see that there's a huge wealth gap, and I'm not disputing that. I'm disputing exactly how it is that one would describe it, and it's a relatively minor point. But those are the wealth holdings. This is home ownership, and again, huge racial disparities, and the trend is consistent over the last half century. There's no tendency toward convergence in these data that I'm showing you of wealth, of income, home ownership. Poverty rates are higher. There has been some closing over the last 40 years in racial disparity and poverty rates, but you can still see that over a quarter of African Americans are living in households below the poverty line. That breaks down poverty by age, and again, for African American children under the age of 6, you can see what you can see there. Almost over 2/5 are living in households that are poor. These are unemployment rates. They fluctuate, and of course, they're down now with the economy going as strong as it is, but there's still a non-trivial racial disparity. College education trending upward for everybody. The racial gap is still there. And by the way, affirmative action hasn't got anything to do with whether or not African Americans go to college. It has to do with which colleges we go to. If I want to close the college education gap, I can do that without practicing one whit of affirmative action. Affirmative action is about elitism. It's about the most selective institutions. As you may know, most colleges admit just about everybody who applies because they want the tuition income. Affirmative action is about choosing elites. All the more reason that I'm exercised about the prospect that those choices would come to be founded in a permanent and institutionalized practice of judging African Americans by a different standard. This is social mobility, share of children born in the bottom fourth who end up either in the bottom or the top fourth, and as you can see, they're remaining in the bottom fourth, almost 2/3 of African Americans compared to 1/3 of white. Progressing up to the top of the income distribution over one generation, a small 1 in 25 African Americans and 1 in 7 whites. A huge difference in social mobility by race, kind of thing that Raj Chetty and his colleagues have been documenting in their elaborate studies on US tax data about social mobility. These are homicide victimization rates. That's not really the subject of my talk here. It doesn't have much at all to do with affirmative action, but it has a lot to do with inequality and with human development. And as you can see, if you want to compare whites and blacks, you need to add a 0 to your vertical scale to put them on the same graph, because the differences are an order of magnitude in terms of homicide victimization and committing the act of homicide. These are homicide offending statistics. Again, I don't want to dwell on this, but I do want to underscore the urgency of the problem of racial inequality. Again, I don't want to be misunderstood. To have misgivings about affirmative action is not to be indifferent to the problem of racial inequality, quite the opposite. To be serious about the problem of racial inequality ought to cause one to have misgivings about the practice of affirmative action, to the extent that that practice sucks up all the air in the room and displaces a deliberation and then a plan of action oriented toward redressing the root causes of the difficulty. Test scores are merely a messenger. They're only telling us what people know. If we are refusing to hear and act on the message, that's on us. Disparities in family structure, and one could go on about this for a long time. This is breaking out households by race, where children are being raised by race, and asking about the composition of those households. And what you can see there is that over half of children are living in households who are African American, are living in households where there's a female parent and no spouse present. Again, I really want to avoid misunderstanding. This is not some kind of moralizing up here. People ought to marry when they have their kids or whatever. I happen to think that, but that's not what I'm arguing here. Get mad at me if you think that having mothers and fathers married when they have children is a bad thing. That's what I think, but that's not what I'm arguing here. I'm concerned about development. What you'd have to persuade me of to keep me from showing a slide like this is that it doesn't matter for the development of the child whether or not the child is raised in a household where there are 48 hours a day of adult supervisory time and 2 people's incomes available to support the children in that household. You have to persuade me that it doesn't matter. That's going to be hard for you to do. I'm convinced that it does matter. I'm convinced that children who grow up without the benefit of and security of 2 parents in the home have a tougher road to hoe, a tougher path through life. That's what I'm convinced of. That's real inequality. Does it have roots in slavery? Undoubtedly it does. Is it related to the fact that African American family life was at the subject whim of the slave master for all of those generations? Undoubtedly that's so. I'm not a sociologist. I couldn't give you chapter and verse on that, but I'm quite happy to be persuaded that there's a historical root here. What is going to be done about it, if anything, becomes the question. Not who to blame. I mean, I want to go back to this narrative issue, because you can make a very good living today advocating on behalf of the interests of African Americans with finger pointing, by finding who to blame and then blaming them loudly. It turns out that unless that leads to the development of the capacities to function in economic and social terms for African Americans, it gets you nowhere. Anyway, non-marital births, you can see what you can see there. In a recent year, that's 2014, over 70% of the children born to an African-American woman were born to a woman who wasn't married. Again, this is not a moral crusade that I'm on. I'm asking the question about whether that is a reflection of social health or social ill health. Pregnancy rates have declined for teenagers. Abortion rates have also declined, although there's a substantial racial disparity. That's numbers per 1,000, so that's 2.7% of women in a given year between the ages of 15 and 44 having an abortion, according to this data, which comes from the Guttmacher Institute. Here is the root of the issue as far as the underrepresentation of African Americans in elite venues of higher education is concerned. The precursors of that are evident in the statistics very early in the life of young people in the United States. Okay. So this table is giving us, for youngsters, 4 years old if I'm not mistaken, the extent who exhibit proficiency in the recognition of letters and numbers. And you can see there that African American youngsters lag behind white and Asian American youngsters in terms of their ability to exhibit their proficient recognition of numbers and shapes, as well as of letters at the age of 4. And I'm going to show you over the next few charts results of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is a comprehensive survey of American young people at the 4th, 8th, and 12th grade that examines them on their mastery of skills in English, reading, I should say, and in mathematics. This is the 8th grade, I said, 4th, 8th, and 12th grade. This is the 8th grade finding from, it's been a bit of, this is the most recent data that I could get. There's probably more recent data available. It's been a while, 2007, but I don't think the basic picture has changed. The blue bar to the left of that center line are the proportion of the youngsters taking the exam who exhibited below basic performance in the particular skill. In this case, it's reading achievement. That's almost half of black youngsters. This is the same chart for the 12th grade by race, in an earlier year, but again, giving you the proportion of each group exhibiting below basic proficiency in mathematics, I should say in reading at the 12th grade. And here are numbers for mathematics. For the 4th grade, again, you can see what you can see there. At the 4th grade, over a third of African Americans and nearly 3/10 of Hispanic Americans exhibit below proficiency performance in mathematics. At the 8th grade, that number for African Americans goes up to 50%. At the 12th grade, below basic proficiency in mathematics is examined by the National Assessment for Educational Progress. That's 70% of African Americans. That's the problem. I don't have a magic wand to make it go away. I don't mean to make light of it. Okay, we can talk about solutions. My mouth is not a prayer book. I don't happen to have the answer to problems that are befuddling an entire society. But if we don't figure out what the problem is and address it, we're not going to get to equality. Remember, that's my benchmark. That's my goal. That's what I want to achieve. That's what I think we should be trying to achieve. True equality. Equal dignity, equal respect, equal performance, equal productivity. What affirmative action does in the hands of the wrong people is paper over the problem and pretend that it doesn't exist. That's a mistake. Anyway, proficiency in mathematics at the 12th grade. Here's the proportion of youngsters in the 9th grade who will earn any credit in advanced placement courses broken out by math and sciences and also by ethnicity. And you can see what you can see there. African Americans are underrepresented amongst those advanced placement courses, but how could it be otherwise? Given the data that we just saw a moment before, how could it be otherwise? You want to do affirmative action on that? You want to start affirmative action earlier? If it's such a good thing, why are we waiting until people get to college to do it? You want to have affirmative action selections into advanced placement courses, or is it racism? Is it that the high school guidance counselors and teachers, when they see a black kid, determine for themselves that this kid is never going to have a chance to excel in the advanced placement courses the way the Asian kids do? Is that what's going on? Do you really believe that? Behavioral disparities across racial groups in terms of disruptive behavior inside of the schools. We can ask the same question about that. This is a big number here. 19%, almost 20% of African American males experienced during a particular school year an out-of-school suspension. That's a huge number. The U.S. Department of Education has addressed itself to this disparity, which you see in many school districts around the country. Under President Obama, the Department of Education sent a letter around to local school districts telling them that we're looking at your data, and we see racial disparities in suspension, and if that persists, you're going to have a civil rights investigation on you. The Trump, Betsy DeVos Department of Education sent a letter around to the same people saying, never mind, we're not going to do that after all. No surprises on either end of that, okay? And if it needs to be said, I'm not a fan of the Trump administration or of the Betsy DeVos Education Department, but I actually agree with that letter that they sent around. I would, wouldn't I? I agree with the letter because I've considered the possibility that the differences in the rates of suspension of youngsters in schools who are black men versus who are white just might be a reflection of differences in their behavior inside the school building, as opposed to an expression of differences in the way that they're being treated and viewed by the school teacher. I don't know which is true. I really don't know. I just know that the first could be true. If it were true, and I enjoined the school district from acting on the fact of the racial difference in the youngsters' behavior inside the school building by threatening them with a civil rights lawsuit, I will have done nothing either to recognize the problem or to remedy it. On the other hand, if in fact the school districts just have it in for black youngsters. When they raise their voice, that's a hanging offense. When a white kid raises his voice, they just look the other way. If that's what's going on, fair enough. Let's get the civil rights gendarme in there. But who is doing a study to actually figure out whether or not it's true? The supposition is that a racial disparity is necessarily a reflection of bias. It is not. The point is simple, but I think it bears repeating. The fact that I see disparity in performance between racial groups at some aspect of human endeavor is not ipso facto evidence of bias. To take the stance that it is not to be serious about addressing the inequality problem. It's to pretend that it doesn't exist. The inequality of development, the inequality of performance. We owe these kids more than simply shrugging when they evidence inadequate performance. We owe them more than a cover story. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit. Not really, I'm going to be the same guy, no matter what we're talking about. But I want to change the subject just ever so slightly. From documenting the disparity of development, that was what the first thing was about, to looking more explicitly at the policy of affirmative action in higher education admissions, which I am not against because it violates white people or Asian people's rights, which I'm not against because it's inconsistent with the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution. In fact, I'm not just flat out against it, but I am concerned, deeply concerned. If you told me in 1970, we've never had any blacks at this university, we're going to do something about getting some blacks here, we're going to invest resources in that, we're going to do something about that, no problem. If you said, we must have some African Americans in our student body because streets are burning in the ghettos of America, because we want to create, as the Bowen and Bach, that's William Bowen and Derek Bach, former presidents respectively of Princeton and Harvard University, in a very fine book called The Shape of the River, what they say is, we're running elite educational philanthropies. We're in the business of creating the ruling class of America. That's what we do. That's what Bowen and Bach says. We can't do that and not have there be any blacks amongst those that we are shepherding off into the ruling class. So we're going to practice some affirmative action on behalf of that objective. I don't have a problem with that, at least not as a transitional policy. What I have a problem with, what I'm trying to say to you here, and I'll repeat myself yet again because it's important, that I have a problem with enshrining and making permanent and institutionalizing a practice of judging African Americans by standards in terms of academic excellence that are different from those that are applied to other people. That's a disaster for African American equality. It invites patronization. It invites a kind of contempt. It invites lying, looking the other way, pretending that the underperformance doesn't exist or that it doesn't matter. It invites this orgy of finger pointing. What kind of university would only have 3% blacks in it? They must be racist. So I want to talk about affirmative action. I say that there are a couple of issues here, but I want to kind of move through this because I want to leave some time for questions, and I'm sure there will be some. And I'm happy to allow them, whoever's in charge, to make my presentation available to anybody who should be interested in it or to respond to your email. I'm Glenn_Loury@brown.edu. Feel free to write me, and I'm happy to share my slides or my thoughts with you should you be so inclined. I've been writing technical papers, some of which have been about affirmative action for a long time. One of my early papers was in the American Economic Review in 1993. Will affirmative action eliminate negative stereotypes was the title of that paper. What was I concerned about with my co-author, Stephen Coate of Cornell University? I was concerned that if everybody knows that the dark people in the population, the black people, the black American people, have been admitted under a lower standard, that their reputation of those students will be marred by that. Because we can say it's racist to draw the conclusion that African American students on average are not as sharp as others since they've been admitted under a less strenuous bar. But it's very rational to do that. We can say that it's racist, but that's merely using all the information that's available to us. If we institutionalize the practice of using a different standard of selection, how can we keep people from taking on board the logical implications of that practice? I'm going to show you some numbers about the admissions populations of students who are applying to and are accepted at Harvard University that's been made public as a consequence of this lawsuit. And I think you'll begin to see what I'm talking about. Again, nobody's going to say it out loud. No one who's been around for a while and has become socially adept at managing their way through American society is going to explicitly state, well, I see a lot of black faces in there. I wonder how many of them are really up to doing my calculus. No one's going to say that. But a lot of people are going to think it if, in fact, the SAT quant scores for the black students who are admitted to the university are a standard deviation below those of everybody else. That's unhealthy. It's not equality. I thought we were in the game for equality. I didn't know that it was we were in the game for political spoils. I got leverage and I can make you do this. I'll throw a tantrum if you don't do it. I thought we actually wanted equal respect. So one of the issues is about incentives as well as reputation. Incentives. Think about this. If you want to go to a good law school in America and you're white or Asian, you had better have an A or an A minus average in your GPA in college, and you had better be scoring at the 90th percentile of test takers on the LSAT. Otherwise, you're not going to be admitted to the University of Michigan, to Boat Hall at Berkeley, not to mention Yale or Harvard or Stanford. You're not going to be admitted if you're white. If you're black and you've got an A minus or B plus average at a good feeder school, and you're at the 70th percentile of the LSAT test takers, you're almost guaranteed to get in most of these places. Do you think that has any effects on the incentives of young people as they go through their preparations with the goal in mind of getting into law school? You think it doesn't matter? Forget about race. Let me take 2 samples of white students and tell one of them, if you don't have an A minus with a 90 percentile LSAT, you ain't getting in, and tell the other one, if you got a B plus and a 70 percentile, you'll get in. And we can do a controlled experiment and see whether or not there's any behavioral differences in those 2 populations. These are human beings and they respond to incentives. Why would we so configure our practices so as to communicate negative incentives for performance to the people whom we're trying to encourage to perform? Do you think that's a remedy for the disparity in performance problem? I don't. So these are some issues that we have to be concerned about. The mismatch issue is another issue. That is, I speak like an economist now. First I talk about incentives. Now I'm going to talk about resource allocation. You've got a lot of different colleges and you've got a lot of different kids. There's a matching problem that goes on when kids in colleges get together and decide who's going to go where. The bottom line on that matching problem is that kids of given ability to do intellectual work get assigned to colleges where the demands on student abilities are whatever they are. Some colleges are more demanding than others. The ones that admit from the far right tail of the distribution of academic performance among its applicants are bound to be a tougher slog for anybody who's trying to take the courses at that college. So there's a matching question. And there can be a mismatching issue. If the consequence, here, let me show you this. This is Justice Scalia being depicted by a political cartoonist as a Klansman because he dared to ask from the bench of the Supreme Court a question of an attorney in an affirmative action litigation case about whether or not there couldn't be a problem if you tried to bring African American students who weren't up to doing the work to colleges just so that you could fill out your form and say that you had a higher percentage of blacks amongst your student body. Might those kids have been better off, says Scalia in a question he's asking, if they had been allocated to a less rigorous intellectual environment more suited to the level of a performance that they're exhibiting? That's the question. I'm not advocating that. I'm merely pointing out that there's a question here. I'm a social scientist, okay? So the question warrants to be studied with data to ascertain whether or not the concern is valid. I believe that that's all that Scalia was calling for. And unfortunately, some of my slides didn't make the cut, but that's all right. This question has been studied by two economists. Peter Arcia Decano is at Duke. And this is the graph that I wanted to show you. So this is the proportion of African Americans at a variety of colleges, where the colleges are arrayed along the horizontal axis based on the average SAT score of the students who attend that college. So to the left are colleges that are not very selective at all because the average SAT score is like 600. That's a very low combined SAT score. For the what top number is 1,600 for the students. So those are not at all selective colleges. And the colleges on the right are the very elite selective colleges where affirmative action is actually practiced. The colleges in the middle, by and large, are not even practicing affirmative action because they're admitting pretty much everybody who applies. And what you can see is that the distribution of African American students across colleges arrayed by how demanding they are on the students, measured by the average SAT score of their student bodies, is skewed. If colleges are competing for African American kids, of course, the more elite colleges are going to have a leg up in the competition. We call that cherry picking. Okay, so the Browns and the Harvards and the universities of Pennsylvania are going to have a leg up over the Penn State and the University of Illinois Chicago and the University of Rhode Island in attracting talented African American youngsters, because if you're an applicant, you'd obviously rather go to Brown than the University of Rhode Island in almost all cases. But you might find yourself in the left tail of the distribution of academic preparation at Brown, and you might find yourself in the sweet middle part of the distribution of academic preparation at the University of Rhode Island. Who's made worse off and who's made better off in that deal? I get that Brown is made better off because we can report now a better number of African American students amongst our student body. It is less than obvious, it's a trade-off, that's why they call it a trade-off. It's less than obvious that the student is better off. Might be because Brown is a more valuable credential. Might not be because if you're at the bottom of your class, even at Brown, you might learn less than if you're in the middle or the top of your class someplace else. It's an empirical question. It's not a question of principle. Depicting a Supreme Court justice as a racist because he asked the question is foolishness in the extreme. It's finger pointing and it's tantrum throwing. And it works. It will work. You can shut people up. But you're not going to teach any black kid to do anything that he didn't or she know how to do before you started talking. And that's the issue here. So this is a schematic indicating the trade-off possibilities. See, College A is better than College B for all levels of academic preparation in the graphic on the left. But College A is better than College B only for students who have a relatively high level of academic preparation in the graphic on the right. If we're at the graphic on the left, there really is no trade-off. Black students are always going to be better going to College A than College B. If we're at the graphic on the right, where being well-matched, let's say it's Caltech and they're doing physics or chemistry, and you're in the classroom, where being well-matched really matters. Maybe you don't want to be at Caltech if you don't really have a mastery over differential and integral calculus. Maybe you want to be someplace else. You still want to learn physics. That's the issue that is being engaged by these people, and they have some results. The mismatch hypothesis is described in that circled area there. It argues that beneficiaries' preferences are misplaced academically. It may be true, it may be false. But let's take a look at some of the data. These are dated somewhat. I mean, it's from the 90s, okay, so this is a while ago. The distribution of academic indices by applicants to the University of California at Berkeley. The solid lines are minorities. Those who are admitted are to the right. Those who are rejected are to the left of the solid line. The dashed lines are white applicants. Those who are admitted to the right. Those who are rejected to the left of the dashed lines. And you can see that the admitted blacks are very comparable to the rejected whites in terms of the distribution of their academic indices in that particular case, which is underscored by that graphic. This is law school admissions. I was just talking about law school. Data coming from the University of Michigan because there was a big lawsuit there maybe 20 years ago. And you can see what you can see there amongst the white admitted. That's that furthest bell-shaped curve, a dashed line way over to the right, centered to the right of 0. 0 is the mean of the entire population of applicants. They're scored in terms of standard deviation indices above or below the mean. And the solid line of black admits is, as you can see, barely overlaps with the white admits. Now, I don't know whether that matters or not in a law school classroom. Do you see what I'm saying there? The solid line, the heavy dark solid line, is the distribution of academic indices amongst blacks admitted to the University of Michigan Law School. The heavy dashed line is the distribution of academic indices of white applicants who are admitted to the University of Michigan Law School. They barely overlap. The question I want to pose, and I literally don't know the answer to it, is does it matter? Inside the classroom, does it matter? In constitutional law, does it matter? I don't know. I suspect it might. I can tell you that in the graduate economics courses that I teach, it matters. It matters whether or not students have mastery over the technical apparatus that is being employed when we do the statistics and we do the mathematical analysis of the models. It matters a lot. Maybe it doesn't matter in law school. Or maybe it does matter and people simply paper over the fact that it matters. I don't know if that's true. I know it could be true. Do we care? If we're interested in equality, we damn sure ought to care. Because equality should be the goal. So let me try to conclude this presentation. There's a lot more here that I could talk about by just sharing with you a little bit of these data, which are public. There's a website somewhere. These are public documents. Compiled by the economists who were expert witnesses on either side of the Harvard lawsuit that has been to trial and awaits a decision to be handed down by the judge in the federal district court in Boston. Now, I'm aware of the fact that the man behind the Asian coalition that's suing Harvard is conservative. I think his name is Alex Bloom, if I'm not mistaken. I know he's conservative. I know he's a bad guy. Because he hates affirmative action, and he's hated it from day one, and he believes it should be a colorblind society. I don't embrace all of his positions about that. But I am interested in the facts. I hope that's okay. I want to know what's going on in the admissions process at Harvard. So here are some facts. This is the argument that the expert witness representing the Asian American plaintiffs in this case is making. He's saying, if you look at the qualifications of the Asians who are applying to Harvard and you compare them to other groups, whites, blacks, and Hispanics, you will see that they are better qualified, but they are admitted at lower rates. I can't get this pointer to work, but that bottom blue line is over a series of cohort years, and those years are, if you apply and admitted in 2010, you're in the class of 2014. I mean, so there's a 4-year kind of, that's how they designate what the cohort is. That blue line at the bottom is the proportion of Asian applicants who are admitted over a series of years. You can see that Harvard is becoming more selective overall over the course of the 21st century. They are admitting a smaller proportion of their applicants in the year 2018, the class of 2018, than they did for the class of 2000, significantly smaller. It's down under 5%. And therefore, of course, the disparity in admission rates, since they're all falling, has also declined. But the Asians are the lowest and the African Americans are the highest in terms of the proportion of the applicants who apply to Harvard who are admitted. This doesn't control for their qualification, it just looks at the raw number. Likewise, the Asian Americans have the higher test scores. They are the least likely to be admitted, but they are presenting the strongest academic qualifications. The dashed line at the top is of Asian American admits, and it's the average of the SAT scores amongst those who are admitted who are Asian American. And you can see that that's for one exam, not two. It's over 760 on an 800 scale. And you can see what you can see about African Americans. Amongst the dashed lines of those admitted, they have the lowest average SAT score of the applicants who are admitted to Harvard. This is part of Arcia DeCano's argument. Here's another part of his argument. He simply asked, tell me for applicants to Harvard University over an extended period, I think it's like 6 years, between the class of 2014 and the class of 2020, tell me what decile of the distribution of academic index does each group fall. Decile is a 10% cut. So decile number 1 is the lowest 10% of applicants arrayed by their academic index. The index, by the way, is an average of the high school grades and the admissions test scores. So they create an index. So as you can see there, for African Americans, almost 39% of the applicants were in the bottom 10th of the applicant pool in terms of their academic index. For the whites, it was 5%. They're in the bottom 10th. 90% of the applicants had stronger academic indices than the bottom 10th. But 40% nearly of African Americans are falling in the bottom 10th, and 60% are in the bottom 2/10. That means 4 in every 5 applicants presented better academic qualification than 60% of the African American applicant pool. Look at the top of the distribution of academic indices. That's the 10th decile, where you can see that less than 1% of African American applicants to Harvard presented academic qualifications that were in the top 10% of the applicant pool, compared to 8% in a third of whites and 16% of Asians are in the top 10th of applicants to Harvard, ranked by their academic qualification. Now, this is just one school, and it's Harvard. Okay? And another statistical side point, you have to take into account that applicants can apply. Nobody can stop you from applying. So there could be a differential selectivity across ethnic groups of who applies to Harvard. It might be that African Americans with relatively low scores are applying at higher rates than whites with relatively low scores, because the whites know they're not going to get in and it's not worth their while to apply if their scores are not very high. And the blacks know that there's some chance that they might get admitted, notwithstanding the fact that they're at the bottom of the distribution of academic qualifications. So we need to take that fact on board. Okay. Still, now, you see that. Look at this. This is the rate at which you're admitted to Harvard if you're an applicant from the various racial groups, differentiated by what decile of the pool of applicants you fall into in terms of your academic index. So you remember, I said that a large number of African Americans were in the bottom 2 deciles, over 60%, but they don't get admitted at a very high rate at all, which is support for my hypothesis that the application behavior may be very different between the racial groups. A lot of low-scoring African Americans are applying to Harvard because they think they might have a chance of getting in. But they don't get in, nobody gets in the bottom decile of 4%, 0.4%, 0.4%. That's nobody. In the top decile, If you're black, you got a 50-50 chance of being admitted to Harvard. If you're a strong academic performer and you're black, it's a coin flip whether or not you get admitted to Harvard. If you're a strong academic performer and you're Asian American, you've got less than a 10% chance of getting admitted to Harvard. That's why they're in court. But look at the intermediate deciles. Suppose you're a good but not a great student. Suppose you're in the 7th decile of the distribution of academic performance, between the 60th and 70th percentile of the population. If you're black, you've got over a 1/3 chance of getting in. If you're Asian, you've got a 1/30th of a probability of getting admitted. Now, Harvard is going to say, and have said, that we're interested in well-rounded people. We're not only focused on academic performance. We have a broad template that we employ when we decide how to compose our class. And what they're asking you to believe is, because that's all fair, the qualities other than academic qualities that they're looking for in students just happen to manifest themselves at a vastly higher rate among African Americans than they do among Asian Americans. They're going to have a hard time persuading anybody of that. Okay, so I propose, after an hour of this, to, with your permission, sir, open up the discussion for questions. Let me offer a little summary statement here, because you can see I'm exercised. Now, why would emotion creep in here? First of all, I know there's going to be pushback, okay? And so I'm anticipating it and I'm steeling myself. But more importantly than that, I really care about this issue. I want our students to be able to stand on solid ground as equally effective participants in the enterprise of higher education without pretense and without lying. Disparities in preparation will reflect themselves after admission. Unless we actually succumb to the temptations of relativism and refuse to make any distinctions or draw any lines, somebody's paper is actually going to be better written than somebody else's paper. Somebody's going to be able to do the problem set and get the correct answers to the problem, and somebody else is not going to be able to do it. Somebody is going to be able to read the material, absorb what it says, and coherently recant with critical eye what's been written better than other people are able to do it. Unless you believe that the admissions criteria, the test scores, the grades, and all the rest are unrelated to those performance criteria, if you compose a class using different standards, you're going to compose a class with differences in performance. That's a logical necessity. Let me repeat it. Unless you believe that the criteria that are being used to select students are unrelated to their post-admissions performance, if you use different criteria to select black students, you're going to get, on average, different performance. People are different. I don't mean to paint with a broad brush, but I am a statistician by training. There's an unescapable logic to that. Now, you can do two things with that differences in performance. You can pretend that it doesn't exist. That's what I mean by lying. Or you can make it evident in the way in which you deal with the people who are in front of you. The temptation to repair to the former is overwhelming. That's not equality. You think they don't know? They know and they're not saying. Because there's a political understanding that what we need to do to deal with the legacy of slavery and racism is to patronize African Americans. So I'm exercised because that makes me angry. Thank you. Sir.
So if I
Who's going to stop you, man?
So think about the the most elite colleges. Take a Harvard, or even if we took Holy Cross, not as elite, but we have many more students who could achieve here than we actually accept. And Harvard has many, many more students who could achieve well than they accept.
You're quite right. I just want to find this graph here. Harvard admits 1,800 people, and you're looking at the number of applicants who have perfect SAT math scores. It's 3,450. They could fill their entire class with students who had perfect SAT math scores. That's the point I believe that you're making. I just wanted to give a little bit more concrete representation of that. This is from the other side's brief, the side that's defending Harvard by making the case that, okay, I agree with you. The Asians are stronger academically than the rates that they're being admitted. I agree with you, but that's not all we care about. We could make our whole class consist of people with perfect SAT scores if we wanted to. We wouldn't be Harvard if we did.
So even here, we're shaping a class. We're looking for certain qualities in people. We're looking for the kind of America we want to create, the kind of Holy Cross alums that we want to put out there. It's not been my experience that we accept students who can't achieve here because we are fortunate enough to have there. So we're choosing from within, a big pool of people who have varying levels of skills. Do we have an obligation only to those at the very top level? What's wrong with the argument that if we're accepting, two premises that I see here. One is that we are accepting people who we know can achieve. We're not trying to waste anyone's time. And second, that we push the students who do come and don't patronize them, but we say we make them work hard so that something will come out of it. And I certainly, when I look back at students I've taught or known and valued who came in, perhaps at a disadvantage with test scores, but other kinds of skills that were recognized by them, I look at what they're doing and I see the payoff. Ethically, do you see that I don't see a problem with that in a sense.
Well, if the premises are correct, then maybe it's not so much of a problem as I'm making it out to be. The premises being that you may not be, when you practice affirmative action, if you do, I don't know anything about Holy Cross, you may not be using exactly the same criteria across the racial groups, but you're using a criterion that's rigorous enough such that the minority students who are admitted, who may have, on average, of course there will be exceptions, lower academic profiles, are nevertheless able to perform adequately, and again, we need to ask what that means exactly. This is the argument that Bowen and Bach make, frankly, at Harvard and Princeton, and they actually have a number of other elite institutions in their data, in their sample, and they do a longitudinal study that's reported in that book. It's 20 years old, but it's still worth reading, where they follow people after graduation. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say. The proof of whether or not the education had a value individually and socially is what happens to people in their careers after they leave. That's the ultimate assessment, not their grades or whatever. And they find that many of the people who matriculated in their sample at elite institutions who belong to groups who benefited from affirmative action nevertheless go on to have very successful careers and so forth. So, I mean, I'm not entirely buying, I don't know about Holy Cross, the premise that the disparities in academic performance of the sort that we were just observing have no consequence in terms of post-admissions performance. I suspect that they do. I could have shown you, I zipped past it, a study that Arcia Decano, that's the economist at Duke, did of students, here, let me find it actually. Okay, so what they're looking at is the implications of affirmative action admissions for whether or not students who are going into the STEM disciplines at Duke, hold on, here it is, using data on Duke students. They show that conditional on gender African Americans were more likely than white students to have an initial major in the sciences. Okay, full stop. This is at Duke. the black students were more likely than white students to declare a major in the sciences as their intention. Okay. However, their probability of finishing a major in the sciences was much lower. For example, amongst those who expressed an interest in science, 54% of African American males ended up with degrees in the humanities or the social sciences compared to 8% of white males who had come in intending to do science. That's Duke. It's just one school. What that is saying is that the black kids who want to do physics or chemistry or biochemistry or biology or whatever at Duke end up giving up at vastly higher rates than do the white students who have expressed the same interest, even though they come in with comparable or even greater intention to pursue a study of science. So that's at Duke. And you could say, so what, not everybody has to do STEM. Of course, that's true. Not everybody has to do STEM, but that would be, to the extent that it's true about Duke, clear evidence that there are post-admissions consequences to the use of different standards for admitting the students. Kid wants to do science, but can't cut it in the classroom where the kids are doing science at a rate that is beyond his kin.
Most of our students who ever wanted to be physicians filter out whatever their race is. And part of me says, so what's wrong with that? People do find a different career track. I could probably, if I looked in the room and I said, how many kids came in wanting to be pre-med?
Well, how about this? How about if the kid had gone to the University of North Carolina or North Carolina State with an intent to major in biology, and they actually got the degree in biology, versus going to Duke with an intent to major in biology and ending up with a degree, with respect, in sociology. I mean, we can't resolve this, without actually looking at the data, and I don't mean to be dogmatic about it, okay? So it may not be that this kind of effect is very widespread at all. You mentioned my video blog, The Glenn Show. At bloggingheads.tv, just go to The Glenn Show and you can't miss me. And what I do is it's a podcast and I interview people, and so I interviewed this woman. She's a conservative, okay? Her name is Amy Wax, and she's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. And I was interviewing her about affirmative action at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and she teaches, or at least she used to teach, a class to first-year law students that was a required class on civil procedure. And she said that she rarely saw a black student who are, 15% of the students at Penn Law in the top half of her first-year class. She rarely saw it. And she said this on my video blog. And a firestorm erupted of people accusing her of being a racist. I don't think she's a racist, but she could be, I don't know. But I don't think her having said that makes her a racist, if it's true. Okay. No evidence was presented to contradict, although many assertions were made, the truth of her claim. I don't know if it's true, but if it's even close to being true, that at that particular institution, in that particular classroom, it was rare to find a black student in the top half of the class, even though they were a sixth of the students in the school. That's shocking. That's not equality. That's my argument. So, yeah, I think you put your finger on the idea of, what kind of social output are you here at the College of the Holy Cross interested in producing. You want alumni who move through the world with a certain effect. You want to be able to situate yourself against the historical narrative of America trying to make right by its African-American citizens. You want to situate yourselves on the right side of history with respect to that question. And what would be wrong with your attending to racial identity when you made admissions decisions, so long as there wasn't any really substantial consequence in terms of the post-admissions outcome. I admire that. I respect it. I'm dubious about whether or not it generalizes, even if I take you at your word that it's true here at the Holy Cross. Yes?
Hi, thank you for your talk. Fantastic. I guess my first question would be, with affirmative action, there's the bias way forward, or the other way forward that you were pointing out, saying at these structural problems. why can't we do both, say? Or is the way forward practically probably to do both?
Well, the argument that I'm making is do the one and don't institutionalize the other, okay? You can do both. In other words, my answer to you is you can do both. But one of them is actually solving the problem, and the other is a Band-Aid, putting it in crude terms. That's basically what I'm saying. But you certainly can do both. And you shouldn't allow the doing of the second, affirmative action, to be a substitute for the doing of the first, which is investing in the development of our people. And by the way, all of our people, it doesn't just have to be black people. We want the people in the hill country of eastern Kentucky to also have our attention, I should think. I would imagine. And besides, politically, nothing's going to happen unless you take care of people in western Pennsylvania and the hill country of Kentucky and such like that, too. It is a democracy, after all. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had a question about your slide of 12th grade performance in mathematics. Could we look at that again?
Sure.
And the bar that, no, I think it's one.
That's 4.
Fourth grade, national assessment.
No, 12th grade, please.
12th?
Yes.
Sorry.
No, it had 70%.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just going the wrong direction.
Yes,
Is that it?
that's the one, yes.
Okay, that's what you want. Okay.
Yeah, because I wanted to talk about the right tail. I mean, the
Okay,
bar
good.
there is not the bar that gets you into Duke or Harvard.
Right.
But if you look at at advanced stage, the blacks were 5% and the whites were 3%. So
No, actually, there aren't any blacks. That's where that hashtag is.
it's
The 5 is proficient.
Okay, thank you.
Okay? There aren't any African Americans, unfortunately, in this particular year, in this particular sample, or a number so small as not to be worth reporting. And that will be relevant, I assume, if you're talking about people who might go on to the very specialized kind of training that you get at a Caltech or someplace like that. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, then go ahead.
So my question is it seems like in the lower grade levels, so we're not talking about higher education, is where the issue has started.
Yeah.
And so what do you think the solution would be? You're saying investing in these schools at like the lower grade levels? Or I just want to know what your solution may be. And if you look at, places where the majority of people are black, are there higher test scores?
I don't know the answer to that question. You mean like a high school?
Like a high school in the Caribbean, or an elementary school in the Caribbean where there's majority black, do they have higher test scores than if you're...
They could have higher test scores than white American students, for all I know. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. I happen not to know, and I don't want to speculate about a factual question like that. We could look it up. But I'm sorry, what was the first part of the... Oh, what do we do? What do we do? Okay. So imagine a pipeline or some other metaphor where we got stages of development, and it's possible to intervene at multiple points of development, from early childhood nutrition and home nurse visitations for a mother who might not have much education to teach her how to take care of her kid or teach her about the cognitive stimulative consequences of reading to the kid and things like that. From that to summer camp for relatively talented 7th graders who would go off for a couple of weeks and do, math and sciencey kind of things, or get taken to museums and get exposed to the wider world or whatnot, to tutors who would work with kids who might be identified as promising but may have some developmental issues that could be fostered and so forth, to a 5th year after high school, where before you start matriculating at Swarthmore or Cornell, based on the fact that you didn't exhibit the highest level that we would want to see amongst our student body on terms of reading and mathematics and so forth, where you got a kind of thing. This is what the U.S. Army does for some of the people who are admitted to the service academies, West Point and Annapolis and whatnot, because the Army has a very deep interest in racial diversity. They learned during the Vietnam era that good order and discipline in the ranks is endangered to the extent that all at the top are white and all at the bottom are black. They learned that when enlisted men were throwing grenades into officers' tents and stuff like that over in Vietnam back 50 years ago. The Army has a deep interest in racial diversity, but they have an aversion to using different standards because they can't countenance patronization and having people thought of as being weak and ineffective leaders, because when the guy says, or the woman, charge, if they don't believe that you have the capacities to perform your function, they're not going to follow your orders. Okay, so the Army has I don't mean to go on too long about this, but there's a very good book about this called All That We Can Be. You know the military recruiting slogan, be all that we can be. So the book is called All That We Can Be. It's by Charles Moskos, M-O-S-K-O-S. And it is a study of the Army, how the Army has dealt with the personnel management problem of bringing African Americans. So there are a lot of different places that you could intervene to try to promote. I don't even want to start talking about what do you do about inner city schools and low-income neighborhoods and stuff like that. That's a whole open road of policy argument that I'm not necessarily an expert about. But if I just focused on educational development, there's a lot that you can do. Besides waiting to the point where somebody's applying to a 4-year higher education institution and then putting a thumb on the scale on their behalf.
So it's like investment at younger ages. 'Cause I know for me, I did horribly on my standardized test when I was in 4th grade, so my parents had the means to get me a tutor and get me into a special program to work on those skills. But if there's investment in that, that could help the development stage.
Sure. Yeah. Developmental affirmative action, you could call it. Other questions? Yes, sir. You had your hand up, didn't you?
My question was along the same train of thought, just thinking about the students who are here in the audience. I'm sure many are interested in working and fighting for equality, so I just didn't know if you had any suggestions for them, what they should do in their careers to help combat this problem. I was really struck by these slides and just looking at how the numbers shift as years go by. So if you had any thoughts on what the students in the room here could do to combat this issue.
I wouldn't ask them to do anything, actually, and I mean this with respect. I would ask them to focus on their studies and get themselves established in their careers and in their professions. And then they can do whatever a good citizen feels like they would want to do. And I wouldn't restrict what can be done to the students of color. I would have the responsibility of creating a decent society fall equally on everybody, regardless of what racial group that they belong to. Not that you were necessarily saying that, but I wanted to be clear about that. But I mean, I can imagine a number of different routes here. You can mobilize politically and try to advocate for elected officials and public policies that are consistent with your view about what equality takes. Now, I've made my view very clear. Not everybody's going to share my view. But you can mobilize and you can organize and you can participate in the political and the public discourse on behalf of what it is that you believe in. You can devote your time to institutions, whether it be your church or your mosque or synagogue, or whether it be some civic organization, YMCA or whatever it is like that, big brother, big sister, tutoring. But you can try to have direct contact with people and try to be a beneficial, helpful impact on their lives. You can do that. But I think the main thing that you can do is, if you're talking about young people like young people in this room, focus on your studies, figure out what great opportunity you have, because being at an institution like Holy Cross is a tremendous blessing, and develop yourselves before how do they say in the airplane, put your own mask on before you help somebody else? Yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. We talked about higher education here and affirmative action in that setting. So how do you think that translates to the workforce? Because there's definitely bias in hiring. And how do you think that applies outside of education?
Completely different kettle of fish, in my opinion. First of all, there's something that's kind of true in higher education, but that's really true in the workforce, which is that sometimes the identity of the person is a really substantive contributor to the productivity of the person. If I'm a retailer of sneakers, like Nike or Adidas or somebody like that. And I'm deciding who's going to manage my store, who's going to be involved in product development, whose face am I going to put on the TV in order to create a brand and an image and whatnot. And I know my market. Now, my market is going to be disproportionately minority kids, probably, but my market is basically driven by professional athletics, which is way disproportionately black kids. And I'm going to take that on board as I formulate my business strategy about how to sell sneakers. That's not colorblind. That's exactly the opposite of colorblind. If I'm casting a TV series and I've got characters and, I don't have any people of color in the TV series, that's a real problem for creating what the TV series was meant to create, which was a following and a larger audience that would endure and so forth like that. I call this, when I lecture about this with my students, I say it's like the female gynecologist problem. And then I say that with trepidation in the Me Too era, so please don't get mad at me. Try to understand what I'm saying. The woman prefers to be treated by a woman rather than by a man. I can understand that, okay? Therefore, if I'm training gynecologists and I don't have any women in the class, that's a problem. If I'm standing up a hospital and I don't have any women in my crew for that particular service, that's a problem. They call it bona fide occupational qualification. There's a legal term for this. Gender, in the case at hand, would be a bona fide occupational qualification. There are a lot of things in the workforce that are bona fide occupational qualifications that turn on race. And I don't really think there's anything quite like that in higher education, although the idea that I'd have a lily white class, is deeply problematic, both for the brand of the school and you could argue for the effective pedagogy of the school. You would want to have a diversity of students within the school. And the question is how much and at what price. And that's another thing I should have said. Affirmative action doesn't have to be 0-1. There is an issue of degree. So if it's, I use a very simple kind of framework here. Say I got a line I'm cutting off. You got to be above 90, you get in, below you don't. And I don't get many blacks. I can lower the line for blacks to 85. I can lower it to 80. I can lower it to 70. I can lower it to 50. It really matters whether it's 85 or 50. So that trade-off is a margin on which you can calibrate the extent to which you're prepared to incur one kind of cost on behalf of another kind of benefit. I'm not saying there's no benefit to the institutions. I'm saying, however, that if this is the way we're going to do it and we permanently institutionalize this, it's inconsistent with achieving equality. That's been my argument.
We're going to need to end there.
I'm okay with that.
Anyway, thank you. Sorry, Larry.
Thank you, Vaughn. Thank you. Thank you.